Morning, panelists and audience members. My name is Tolu Ekon, and I'm a principal at BCG Lagos. I am excited to be having this conversation with you all today on ways to reignite Nigeria's energy sector. No doubt, the Nigerian oil and gas and power subsectors are crucial. The government depends on the oil and gas subsectors for over 90% of its revenue, which is necessary for investments to diversify the economy, create jobs, and build infrastructure. Power also, electricity is also essential, is an essential ingredient for the economic development that we need. World Bank research shows that there's a strong correlation between electricity consumption and GDP size. So these are the things that we are here to talk about today, the problems and challenges we have in our energy sector and the opportunities we see to turn them around. I am thrilled to have the broad panel we have today. It's one that has producer, infrastructure, retail, regulator, financial, and research perspectives. And I'd like to introduce our panelists now to get these perspectives, starting with Mr. Avuru, Mr. Austin Avuru, who's the CEO of Seplat Petroleum Development Company, one of the leading Nigerian indigenous oil and gas companies. Mr. Abayomi Awobokun, who's the CEO of Enyo Retail and Supply Limited, a downstream player. Dr. Viva Boer, I'm not sure he's joined us yet, but he should be here, who's the CEO of All On. Mrs. Onyeche Tifase, who's the CEO of Siemens Nigeria. She's also the vice chair of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group and the president of the Nigerian German Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Eyo Ekpo, who's the MD of Expedite Consulting Limited, and he brings the regulator perspective for us as well, having been a former commissioner at the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Mrs. Rolake Akinkugbe Fulani, who's the MD of Energy Inc. Advisors and Senior Africa Advisor at the IFU Danish Investment Fund. She'll bring the financial and the advisory perspective for us. And last but not the least, Mr. Henry Adigun, who's the team lead at the Facility for Oil Sector Transformation in Nigeria. So welcome to the panelists and welcome to the audience. Before I pose questions to our audience, I'd like to ask and remind our audience members that we'll be taking questions from them. So if they have questions, please type them into the chat box and we will strive to get to them. Before we get to the audience, I'd like to hear from our panelists, and I'd like us to start with the challenges faced in the respective energy subsectors. And I'd like us to also include the lens of COVID-19, which is something that we're living through right now. And there's indications that this will be with us for a while. So Mr. Avuru, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. The premise of our conversation here is that there continues to be opportunity for the oil and gas sector to drive Nigeria's development. Seplat is in a bit of a unique role because it serves it supports the revenue goals of the country, the revenues which is essential to develop the country, but through the oil business. But then Seplat also supports on the electricity side, right, through its gas business. So I'd like to just get your take on this premise that the oil and gas sector is critical to Nigeria. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the challenges. And if it makes sense, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on how COVID-19 crisis is affecting things within the sector. Mr. Avuru.
All right, thank you. Let me just give a few basic facts that have emerged from the COVID-19 crisis that we've had now for almost 4 months. Oil prices have crashed. To show up oil prices, there have been volume restrictions from OPEC Plus. And so a combination of volume restrictions and lower oil prices will mean lower revenues for operators, lower revenue for the host country in terms of rent. The immediate impact is that operators have had to cut down on their capex. And when you cut down on your capex, it means that you are letting contractors, you are terminating contracts. If you take our case, for instance, we're going to be operating 4 to 5 rigs, drilling about 18 wells. We've cut down that to seven wells, 1 rig right now on contract, which means 3 to 4 rigs have been let go. Each of those rigs will probably have 200 personnel on board. So that's the number of staff whose jobs are at risk. Let those rigs go. So the entire multiplier effect will be job losses, lower revenues for both operators and the country. For the economy, of course, you started in your introduction talking about how much revenue is derivable from the oil and gas sector. Unfortunately, as you can see, with these higher costs and lower revenues from oil and gas, if you look at the 2019 budget performance, you will see that oil and gas revenues accounted for only about 45% of total budget revenues. This year, with the crisis we have now, by the end of 2020, oil and gas revenues will probably be less than 40% of total revenues. So that's down from the statistics you were quoting, which is to 90% of oil revenues. We're now down to 45 or less than 40% of total budget revenues. And that is very telling, because all that means is that the place of oil and gas as the major revenue driver for the federal budget is slipping away. And so the diversification that we've been speaking about for decades now, it is upon our laps, whether we like it or not. We have to seek other sources of revenue to fund our budget, because the rental revenues from oil and gas have become much, much smaller as a percentage of the budget than it used to be. So what that means is that, and also you pointed this out, this is where we come in as Seplat. We emphasize our gas delivery to the local economy because of the multiplier effect. If we consume 3 BCF of gas locally, we'll probably be generating some 15 gigawatts of electricity. And that will probably go across the entire West Africa to light up West Africa with all the multiplier effects. Heavy industry, steel, cement, we're now a net exporter of cement. We could do the same thing for petrochemicals. So you can see that the emphasis is shifting from oil and gas rental revenue to fund the budget to gas in particular being an enabler for major economic development and the multiplier effects that come with it. And in doing so, we have to take the entire West African sub-region as our local market in terms of gas distribution, gas to power, gas to heavy industries, and then the multiplier effects that will then generate a lot more taxes from companies' income taxes, from VAT, from withholding taxes, other taxes other than just oil and gas revenues. So that's the diversification that we're seeing ahead of us, particularly using gas as a major enabler. So that's the key message is that we're now moving away from oil and gas as primary revenue to oil and gas as an enabler for major economic development. We're also moving away from just taking Nigeria as our captive domestic market to taking the entire West African sub-region as our captive domestic market. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Mr. Avuru. I really liked the point that you made around gas being, having this multiplier effect, leading Nigeria to now be contributing partly to Nigeria now being a cement exporter, a net cement exporter, and that can happen in other sectors as well. Mrs. Stefansi, I'd like to sort of bring you into the conversation here because one of the points on gas being a multiplier effect goes through the power sector, right? Electricity, is one important way that gas can actually play that role. Siemens has been supporting energy infrastructure for a while now across the entire value chain. But electricity still is a persistent problem in Nigeria. This is something that's come to the fore again as we're all dealing with COVID-19 in our respective lockdown situation. So I'd like to get your perspective. How much of the problems electricity problem we have is linked to infrastructure, which Siemens supports. What are your thoughts on this multiplier effect, which I think goes through the electricity sector that Mr. Avuru mentioned? Mrs. Stefansi.
Thanks, Tolu. First of all, maybe tying, Mr. Avuru has made a lot of good points, and tying the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the declining oil and gas price to the electricity sector, I think it's very evident now. We see increased push from customers who are frustrated with the state of things. Many small businesses are closing at this point. We're seeing the entire social infrastructure affected by the lack of electricity. And as it has been highlighted, this is directly linked to the fact that we have a struggling oil and gas sector right now. Projects are being shifted. For us, indirectly as Siemens, our business is heavily dependent on the oil and gas sectors. And we're seeing a shift from companies who are now asking for massive discounts. They're shifting projects to further years. They're even canceling massive projects that would have enabled a more thriving sector because of the cost pressures arriving from COVID-19 and the oil and gas price shifts. What we're trying to do right now is to work with the government. I think the solution starts from a very inclusive and collaborative one. You've mentioned the diversity of companies on this platform, but organizations are now not just highlighting the challenges, but coming together to find solutions. And it all starts with looking at the consumer and what are the consumer's expectations. You have consumers now who are, I think, less than half of electricity customers are metered, and that is causing another issue across the value chain. So the infrastructure starts first with the consumer, understanding their requirements for small businesses, large businesses, industries, and being able to resolve that through the infrastructure gap. Unfortunately, there's a massive power deficit. We have, I think, a peak of 5.5 gigawatts of electricity operational today has been achieved as of today. And that's a far cry from the minimum of 20 megawatts we need to drive this economy forward. The public perception is that 60 gigawatts of electricity is required to even have a thriving economy at this stage. For 200 million people, you should be targeting as Nigeria 200 gigawatts of electricity. But what we have today is an obsolete infrastructure that needs to be rehabilitated, that needs to be expanded. We have power projects that are coming online, and there's a massive gap between transmission and distribution and ensuring that customers can receive that electricity. There's also poor payment culture, there's poor commercial framework, but we're starting to see massive efforts from the government to resolve these issues. And our collaboration with the government on the Presidential Power Initiative is a very strategic initiative that will start to shift the sector away from one that has closing massive gaps that are not closed and seeing one that is thriving and able to meet the customer demands. Ultimately, it's not just about resolving infrastructure gaps. We also have massive capacity gaps. We're seeing that many of those in the sector are poorly trained or poorly skilled. There's absence of equipment, but there's also absence of knowledge about advanced technologies that should be shifting the sector forward. We also need a healthy energy mix. So targeting, resolving transmission and distribution is insufficient without having sufficient generation. And as Mr. Avuru has said, gas will be the base load. There's no doubt about that. There's a massive drive for decarbonization. Many advanced economies are moving away from gas, but for countries like Nigeria, gas will form the base load of electricity going forward. We need to develop our gas infrastructure to ensure that there's gas accessible from the power generation perspective so that we can transmit and distribute sufficient electricity to end consumers.
Thank you, Mrs. Stefasi. One of the key things that I got from your point, from your input there was the significant shortage that we have right now, given our size and given our economic ambition. I'd like to bring Mr. Awubakun into the conversation at this point because, when the grid fails us, as it currently is, we use our generators. There have been statistics that show that Nigerians, Nigeria is one of the countries with the highest per capita usage of generators. I don't know anyone that doesn't have a generator. And the downstream sector, Mr. Awubakun, that you support is critical to transportation and other applications, but also critical to our energy demands as a country, given where we currently are in the state of the grid. So how would you describe the role of the downstream sector in reigniting energy for Nigeria, the premise of this conversation? What are some of the challenges you are facing?
Look, Tolu, ordinarily, this should be an exciting time for the downstream. we always say lightly that whenever the upstream sector is in chaos, the downstream should bring some relief. But COVID has thrown that on its head. Everybody is going through chaos, chaotic, macro framework. Specifically for Nigeria, let me start with pricing. At the start of the year, we were at 145 naira, and then the government rightfully, through the PPPRA, dropped prices initially to 125 and now to a band between 123.5 and 120 or 121. And those prices are supposed to be reflective of what's happening in the international crude space. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side you're in or on, crude prices are beginning to tend upwards. And so if we don't get the pricing mechanism right and educate the public, we may go from a regime where we were subsidizing and then crude prices dropped, we brought the prices down, and then we didn't have the courage and the mechanism with which to keep the prices reflective of the realities of the product. And the government has done the right thing. There's a lot of literature and narrative around full deregulation. One of the challenges with that is that the framework needs to get increasingly clearer. There must be enabling laws to support that, and the agencies that were previously set up to support a regulated space now have to be adapted to support a deregulated regime. And also, there are the attendant social challenges when you deregulate and the prices move frequently. What happens to inflation? What happens to cost of logistics and transportation? We've got to find a way to manage all that. So pricing is a very interesting challenge. The second is jobs. With deregulation will come a lot of efficiency from the players. So the downstream probably employs up to 100,000 low-paid workers right across the country. And those people, will be the first threatened. What can we do to prepare that workforce to be more valuable to the economy? Otherwise, we fear that they may actually impede the progress that the sector is seeking to make. And so jobs, the future of jobs in the sector, preparing the men and the women in that sector, indeed preparing the regulatory framework to support jobs, it becomes very critical, very key. Technology has a big role to play, but I'm ashamed to tell you that technology plays a very low role in today's downstream sector. It's a huge opportunity and also a threat. We've also got other challenges. Taxes. Under the new Finance Act, there are minimum tax implications for all downstream players. Downstream players typically enjoy very high revenues and very low margins, therefore very low net income. But the Finance Act has a minimum tax implication, which looks at your revenue, and uses that revenue to compute a tax, especially when you are not generating adequate profit. That starts to kick in, I believe, from 2021. The implications are very dire, very scary for most of the players in the sector, especially as margins will decrease with deregulation. In all, I guess our biggest challenge is where the government sits and how the government views the industry, government participation, both as a player and then as our regulators. There needs to be more engagement of both parties, of investors, private sector, and also of the government, as regulators, to prepare the industry for the changes coming. Otherwise, it would be a great time for the industry, and there will be numerous other opportunities. And I'm sure I'll discuss some of those as we go along. Thank you, Tolu.
Well, thank you for that. From you, Mr. Obokun, from Mrs. Tafashe, from Mr. Vuru, it sounds like we have big problems, but they also create big opportunities. Yet we don't see a lot of investment that is, of the same magnitude as the problem coming in. So, Mrs. Akikugbe, I wonder if you can sort of touch on that as somebody who does a lot of advisory covering the breadth of energy and also helping think through financing. Why are we not seeing investments on the scale that is required coming into the sector? What are the challenges that you are seeing and talking to your clients about?
Thank you very much, Tolu, and great discussion thus far from my colleagues on the panel. I think let's even just start with sizing what that investment gap is. To reach universal energy access by 2030, we're looking at an estimated $90 billion at minimum annually to close that gap. That includes closing that gap in Nigeria. At the current rate we're going, UNDP estimates that without sufficient investment in energy infrastructure, there will be a 50-year delay in universal energy access. Clearly, the financing needs are such magnitude that no single institution is capable of meeting them in isolation. And also on the use and production and consumption side, no single source of energy, I concur with pretty much everybody, will be capable of meeting that going forward. I think one of the biggest impacts we're seeing with the COVID-19 era is the competition for credit globally. There's been a global push towards a low carbon future. So a lot of the traditional external sources of finance are now casting their gaze more deliberately on transition fuels, gas and renewables. So the credit space for hydrocarbons, for instance, for an economy like Nigeria that's hugely dependent on hydrocarbons, has been squeezed. But I'm a pragmatist. So once we start to focus on domestic consumption markets, we also need to focus on leveraging domestic sources of funding. In an ideal scenario, Nigeria's financial sector should have the ability to build the capital base needed to fund gas infrastructure, for instance. And we have had the financial depth over the last few years, but there's some critical factors that have impacted that. One of which has been the devaluation of the Naira. The capital size of Nigerian banks and their ability to draw money from external sources has obviously been limited. But then I think if we look at such a capital intensive sector, such as gas or gas infrastructure, what Nigeria really needs to move towards is single digit long-term financing in local currency. And that is something that our market is unfortunately still playing catch up on. So we can't really keep ringing this bell for only long-term and low-cost US dollar financing, because as you know, with many of these projects, you need to mix your currency sources. So in order to plug that gap, we need to develop and enhance the ability of our local capital markets to adequately fund Nigeria's infrastructure. So let me just give you an example. And this is a way of reimagining things. We often talk about the fact that we have this demographic sweet spot, a young, thriving, youthful population. But one of the advantages of that is we actually have low dependency ratios. Our labor force is still rising rapidly, and the impact of aging, unlike many Western economies, has not caught up with countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the developing world. So what this means is that our pension systems potentially form a good base for building out a strong and thriving local capital market source for funding long-term infrastructure. So that is one critical area that I think we need to look at in order to help plug this huge energy infrastructure gap. And then the other thing I would say is, as we move towards sort of diversifying and balancing out our energy mix and reduce our dependency on exports, this whole idea of building domestic sources of funding is that we actually have the ability to create depth and tap into other types of funding, other more creative, innovative sources of funding, because nobody is solely now focused on export-oriented projects. There is a place for that, but I certainly think there is a place to also capitalize on the resources that we have locally. So I do think we need to see further financial sector reform and capital sector reform, and I think we're seeing some of that now. I must commend the work of institutions like the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, who have obviously got a structure that can continue to support development of energy infrastructure locally. But I think we need much more of a concerted effort to do. So I would just summarize by saying we need long-term, cheaper sources of funding locally. We need to be more creative from a regulatory perspective in tapping into local pension funds. And then we need to be creating synergies with other sectors. So one of the areas that has attracted a lot of funding in this climate is healthcare. So can the energy sector think about collaboration and synergies with social infrastructure spaces like healthcare in order to more attract a wider variety of funding sources? These are some of the ideas I wanted to put forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolake. I really appreciate your thoughts. And I think your comments are a good segue from talking about our problems to talking about opportunities. I like how you touched on some of the opportunities for financing within the pension sector and some of the work that government as well needs to do. I'd like to actually, I want to talk about opportunities, and I want to hear some of the ideas that members of the panel have. Before I do that, I'd like to get some government perspective in this conversation. Mr. Ekpo, so we've heard some of the challenges. We're beginning to hear some of the opportunities. I'd like to hear your thoughts on, what role do you see government playing in addressing some of these challenges and seizing some of the opportunities that are being identified? Mr. Obokun talked about certainty, right? Like, with prices and taxes. We are seeing, for example, that as a result of this ongoing COVID-19 crisis, subnationals are beginning to slash right-of-way charges for telecom infrastructure across the country. Do you see similar governance opportunities for the energy sector? Mr. Ekpo.
Right, thank you. And Tolu, and thank you to Business Day for setting this up and giving us an opportunity to get together and talk about this perennial subject of ours, the energy sector in Nigeria and what it can do for the country. Let me start by saying that COVID-19 and its effect on the energy sector, it brings a bit of a false narrative in the sense that all that COVID has done, from my point of view, is simply accelerate a crisis that was already coming. So looking at the electricity sector, we've really been in crisis for the last 5 years. And I think we listen to what all the previous speakers have said, they've addressed it in various ways. We've been in a crisis for the last 5 years, and perhaps it would have come to a head 2021, 2022, but COVID-19 has kind of accelerated that. And so here we are, we now must deal with this challenge. I think that the crisis rests on one singular factor. And if you listen to what Rolake had said, it's the absence of a market that has quality assets that you can invest in. That really fundamentally is a challenge that the electricity sector has. And that crisis, that absence of a market, I think rests on three factors. First one is the crisis of responsibility, if I may use that phrase. And it is that we just simply, market participants just simply don't adhere to our contracts. We don't follow rules. Regulators put out rules by the day, almost literally, and we just ignore them. We do, as someone has said, it's the Federal Republic of anyhowness. So that's one. Another, I think, leads to the question that you talked about, that of governance, and that's leadership, all right? Leadership from 2 points of view. One, or governance from 2 points of view. One from the policy point of view or from the regulatory point of view. I think the jury is out really on the quality of policy making, the quality of regulatory leadership that we've had over the last 4 or 5 years. Talk to players in the market, and something is lacking, which needs to be addressed on the governance side. But also it's matched by, you might say, an absence of quality governance on the private sector side. So every day you see this dichotomy, this discontent between various market groups of, or subsectors of market participants, distribution companies, generating companies, TCN. It's a daily affair. Right now, the key players in the market are in court, suing each other. It's almost as if we don't have a mechanism for reasonably and amicably resolving whatever disputes we have between regulators and the market and between various groups of the market. And these two factors lead us to the critical third factor, which is the erosion of capital across the industry. And this erosion of capital really comes from two things. First, the lack of commerciality arising from the fact that we don't have the right kind of tariffs. And secondly, just the fact that the revenues that come into the sector are just not enough. We just don't pay for what it is we consume, whether as customers or as distribution companies who take energy from the grid and then deliver to those customers. So look, Tolu, every Nigerian comes from a village. right? We all come from villages. We all come from some quiet area where there is something that is the center of our communal activity, and it's a market. So we understand the dialectic, we understand the philosophy of markets, we Nigerians, because we all have markets in our villages, and nobody does in those markets the things that we try to do in the electricity sector. And really, that's really what fundamentally lies at the root of our challenge. So that is our challenge, the absence of a credible market. Now, you know, we've talked about a market, but we actually have functional, I think Onyechi said something about we have a deficit. I don't think we have a deficit, really. We actually have a full-fledged electricity sector, right? And it's probably something like between 40 and 50,000 megawatts. Every one of us, none of us has downtime when it comes to electricity. The question is, who provides it? Okay? We think that the 4,000 megawatt market, which we really fight ourselves over every day, is the market. That is not the market. The true market is the one that provides us our power most of the time. At the end of the day, the 4,000 megawatt market probably delivers, I don't know, maybe 10, 15% of our energy consumption. How many megawatt hours on a daily basis? Maybe I'd say 40,000 megawatt hours, right? But the rest of us, you, me, Cadbury, the oil companies, our schools, our universities, we provide our power for ourselves. Now, that is a market, and that takes me to the opportunity which we've been kind of losing sight of. In Nigeria today, let me put out two sets of numbers. When Azura was being built between 2015 and 2018, this was all that we had in the grid-connected electricity market coming in, new capacity, 450 megawatts between 2015 and 2018. And that was about $900 million. It took us 3 years to build that. And then it went commercial in 2018. In the same period, generator dealers in this country sold between 10 to $12 billion worth of generators. All right, something like 6 to 8,000 megawatts. I mean, between 10 to 12,000 megawatts of capacity or gigawatts of capacity, and about $6 to $8 billion worth. It was sold. It's working. All right. At the same time, renewable energy providers have been quietly taking bits of the market away. And who are the people that are served by this RE providers? The people that we say are poor, who can't pay for the energy. But you know what? None of those renewable energy providers has lost a kobo, whether it's for our generators or for our solar connections. And I think Wiba is on this call. He's going to talk about it, probably a lot better than I can. We pay for whatever it is we provide. What we don't pay for, and what is the cause of all this big talk that we could getting ourselves into, is that small 10%, 15% of our total capacity, of our total energy consumption, of our total energy provision in Nigeria. So what do I see? I see a threat, first of all. Remember, in 2001, let me end it this way. In 2001, we were all customers of Nitel. And then one day, MTN arrived, followed by, I think it was Airtel, and then Glo. And today, nobody talks about Nitel. There was 400,000 connections at that time. Within 5 years, we're doing what? 5-7 million. Today, I hear we've got about over 100 million connections. Nobody talks about the copper wire connection any longer. We never actually really started. So we leapfrogged all the way straight to wireless, all right? And we bucked the conventional trend. If care is not taken, this is the threat. This market that we're also gung-ho about, this 4,000 megawatt market, will disappear. It's already disappearing. Each day, all right, there is one little connection done via solar. There is another big entity, commercial or industrial, that says I'm going off grid, and it becomes permanent. So the only challenge is the one that I think Austin tried to address or touched on, which was, how do we move the alternative market from distillate fuels, for example, to natural gas? Once that logistic challenge is cracked, this big market that we are all so worried about will just disappear. And that is both the threat and I think the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I really like the way you put that fine point on gas and this logistics challenge within the gas sector being a big opportunity, in particular as you have the renewable players also beginning to increase, their share of the market. Mr. Adigun, I'd like to bring you in here. You work on oil sector transformation, and I think the point that Mr. Ekwu just made for the gas sector, and which Rolake touched on from a financing standpoint, and Mr. Avuru touched on as well, is both, one that requires transformation in the oil sector, which would have impact on the electricity sector. So, what do you see as the role of government, picking up from where Mr. Ekwu ended? What do you see as the role of government in seizing this opportunity and helping us identify and take advantage of this opportunity? Mr. Adigun?
Thank you, Tolu. I heard you clearly. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, so I listened very well to everybody's presenting, and I agree with a lot of points they made. Gas is, the minister said this was the year of gas, I think earlier on the year, but the year of gas has been on for the past 7-8 years with nothing tangible achieved in it. Gas is, a lot of people don't know that we have more gas than oil. We're actually a gas country with oil, not an oil country with gas. So the gas availability is large. But gas is something that you have to develop as a commercial process, not as a government policy process alone. So the policies are there. That national oil gas policy approved by the president about 2-3 years ago, before the second term. But what has happened with the gas policy itself? What has been implemented? How do you make gas a commercial transaction process across the value chain? How do you ensure that gas as it is being overregulated and being underregulated and not being properly priced and not having right incentives? How do you make that possible? If we had gas in the country, the issues of power would be very, very minimal. We've had critical closures of power projects due to availability of gas, non-availability of gas. We've had issues when we had to take more of the gas out of the country than use the gas domestically. We're one of the countries in the world who have gas in large quantities, and we're, I think, third in the bottom scale of countries that don't use the gas they have. Now, the issues on gas are issues everybody has mentioned. One, the lack of investment in gas. Secondly, a lack of good fiscal tariffs and fiscals on gas. A lack of infrastructure, a lack of critical dependencies, a lack of a market perspective around gas. And that's been the challenge we've had over the last many years. Now, there's an opportunity now. Oil prices are going to go lower and lower. I don't think it will exceed an average of $35 or $34 based on current inventory and current use, and with the wave of opening up and shutting down. But what will happen is gas can be used domestically. And as Mr. Avuru said, gas can be used to supply the West African market. I know there's a West African gas pipeline being built. I know there are objections around that, a lot of policy around it. But the first thing first is bring gas to the domestic use and reduce dependency on crude. So ensure that you have a gas market thriving with the proper pricing, with the proper policy, proper regulations. And then the optimal take will be easier. The issues of availability, the issues of shutdown, issues of lack of funding, debts in the sector will reduce. But we need to have the right policies. Now, we have an opportunity with the current PIB in draft. The PIB should look at the ways to ensure that we have a clear framework for non-associated gas. We've always done well looking at the gas that comes with associated gas, but there's a lot of associated gas that's wasting away. To look at how to incentivize the network code and make it work. The network code was launched in February by DPR. I don't see it being used by anybody, but that network code is important to get gas aggregation and gas supply. Thirdly, to look at the pricing system. You can't legislate the price of a commercial quantity. Every time we try to legislate price, we've always failed. We had this subsidy in Brooklyn for long years. We're not out of it yet. We're only out of it because price of food are lower. But again, you want to say cap a price for gas. It can happen. Every market must develop organically. First of all, the price systems must be right to allow investors. Then the support system, which is what we don't have. There's no enabling system. So we're bringing an AKK pipeline where there are no markets, where there is no demand. We're doing things on a political scale, not on an economic scale. Like one of the panelists said, we don't have enough funds in country to develop any of these resources. We must make sure that our fiscal systems allow investors to come in, put their money into gas, put their money into oil, and live with it. For me, that's the key way of looking at it.
Thank you very much, Henry. Really appreciate your thoughts. I think you put the nail a bit on the head again with this point on gas. It feels like gas is a big opportunity for us, and I think COVID is making that. It's always been evident, and COVID is making that even more evident. Mr. Vura, I'd like to, there's a question on the board that I'd like to get your take on, and it's about gas as well. Suraj Oyewale mentioned that, the Finance Act is a big disincentive to businesses to invest in oil and gas and
Hello.
So we seem to have lost you.
Yeah, I think we've lost Tolu. Okay, maybe Lily.
We've lost the moderator. Can somebody step in then?
Yeah, someone, because the live session is still behind. So, okay, he's back.
The question was for Austin.
Sorry, was it a question for me?
Yes, about the gas sector.
So what was the question? Sorry,
Tolu, you're on mute.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mr. Vuru?
Yes, now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, very good. Sorry about that. So what I was saying was, Suraj Oyewale asked a question, which I wanted to direct to you before we close, which is, he said, the Finance Act is a big incentive to oil and gas businesses in Nigeria. And we're talking about gas. What are your perspectives around, this enabling environment, and whether or not players are being disincentivized from actually taking advantage of this gas opportunity?
Let me say quickly, between Ayo and Rolake, I think they made the point about funding and a market. We do have a huge market that is constrained. We have as Ayo said, probably a 25 gigawatt market, but it is constrained by all kinds of regulatory issues, pricing and pricing of electricity, ability to pay or willingness to pay, ability or willingness to pay. So the market itself has to be freed up to take up the electricity that can be generated. And when it is freed up, then the funding can come in. It's almost a vicious circle. We are in the middle of a $700 million, 300 million scope gas project with NNPC, Seplat and NNPC, the annual project in the East. It's going to deliver 250 million scope of gas into the domestic market. That will give you 1,000 watts of electricity, 1 gigawatt of electricity straight away. Now, when we talk about the West African sub-region, we already have a pipeline that gets to Ghana. If you extend that pipeline to Senegal and expand the capacity and put 400 million scope of gas into that pipeline, the entire West Africa, that's all they need for all the electricity needs of West Africa. So the market is there, it is huge. Some of us have been making investments in the past 7 years. Seplat has made over $1.5 billion of investment into the gas market. We don't regret it. If you look at our 2019 report, you will see that 30% of our bottom line is our gas revenue. So it's business for us. We deliver gas. we get paid, we get owed for some time, but we eventually get paid. And it is business, it's profitable business for us. And it can be for everybody who gets into it. But that market has to be expanded. The electricity market has stayed at 4,000 megawatts for 5 years now. It grew quickly to 4,000 megawatts by 2015. Since 2015, we haven't crossed the 4,000 megawatts. Okay. And so gas consumption grew rapidly from 300 million scf to 1 BCF per day in 2015, and that stayed there. Now, so once you unlock the electricity market, the heavy industries, we will become a net exporter of fertilizers, as you can see what is going on. Once you unlock those markets, we'll start talking about not 1 BCF anymore, but 2-3 BCF of domestic consumption. That's what we need. The multiplier effects, I can go on and keep naming them. We can talk about gas export. I'm all for gas export. But when you check the 2019 budget performance, 0 revenue went into the federation account from LNG. You can talk all that, LNG and so on. In the past 10 years, go and check how much money came from LNG into the federation account. I'm not talking about 20, into the federation account versus the multiplier effects that I'm describing now if you expand what gas can do to the West African sub-regional economy. It's there, the market is there. Don't constrain it. And then once you remove the constraints, capital will come in. We are in the process of raising funding now. We're putting a lot of equity funding into our project, and we're raising about $350 million. And as Rolake said, half part of it is Naira denominated, part of it is dollar denominated. And we'll get that funding in place, even at these difficult times.
Wow, that was a very sort of strong point. I think we're almost at time now. So I think I'd like us to close on this point of this multiplier effect. There are challenges, but there are a tremendous amount of opportunities for us to sort of, drive the kind of growth we want in Nigeria, and even, expand across West Africa, as Mr. Avuru has said. So given we have to close out, I'd like to get each of our panelists to just wrap up and share how they're feeling, in like 30, 40 seconds. How optimistic are you feeling about our ability collectively? Because it's not just government. Government has a role, but each of the different sectoral players also have role, right? So how are you feeling about the ability to reignite the energy sector going forward, which was the premise of this conversation? Mrs. Tifasi, I'd like to start with you.
Yes, and I was going to jump in even. I'm very excited about the opportunities. First of all, I think there's a realization that we are, time is up. We can't afford to continue to argue these points. Nigerians are creating a negative reputation over the world because of our economic challenges. And the way to close those economic challenges is leveraging the resources we have, ensuring there's sufficient social infrastructure, especially power infrastructure, to ensure that Nigerians can start to create value-added activities and become more of an export-driven nation and start to diversify the economy. The story around diversifying the economy starts, yes, we're talking about the gas to power value chain, but it starts with electricity. Electricity unlocks so much that is lacking today. And with the Presidential Power Initiative, we're addressing so many gaps there, because with the infrastructure gaps are resolved, skills gaps, there's extensive training for those working in and around the sector, access to capital, there's low interest rate funding coming in. And it's these sorts of projects that start to create, I think, that push and pull effect. Yes, there's a debate about on-grid versus off-grid, but on-grid definitely is the base for us to start to develop the economy. And that to start to ensure a diverse energy mix. We bring in also off-grid, microgrid solutions to complement the off-grid, on-grid solutions. But Nigeria is desperate to increase its power capacity to ensure that Nigerians can start to have more opportunities to create social and economic balance. So that's my take on it. I'm very excited about the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like each of our panelists to keep their closing comments to really 15 seconds, because we're literally at time right now. Mr. Digon, I'd like to get your thoughts. How are you feeling? How optimistic are you feeling?
Well, I think a lot of good things are happening. The first good thing is that we're realizing the challenges. COVID has brought it to our nose. It wasn't COVID that caused it, and COVID accelerated what was already a problem. But I think the government is responding rightly in some areas. I think the private sector is listening as well. I think in the next few months, with the right policies and the right kind of guidelines, we'll get there. So I'm a little bit excited. I'm not downcast at all. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. Very good. Ms. Akikugbe Filani, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty optimistic. You know, any economy and any stage of development has to invest and install energy infrastructure in more clever and integrated ways than ever before. And the goal of a low carbon future and utilizing our oil and gas resources today are not mutually exclusive. However, I do think that the grid-based electricity market cannot by itself serve as the basis for credible upstream investment in gas infrastructure, for instance. So we need to diversify. The Danish Investment Fund is making its first off-grid solar investment in the Nigerian market. So I really, the main message is diversification, and I think that is the big opportunity for Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Obokun, quickly, your thoughts and how optimistic you're feeling.
Exciting time for downstream as well. Dangote refinery is a major, move by the Dangote Industries. We expect that to come on stream in the next 12, 18, 24 months. New products, new scales, thousands of jobs. The other private refinery initiatives, coming on stream, opportunities for investments in logistics, incentives by the government in clean energy initiatives are also gaining ground, cooking gas for every Nigerian. I think it's a good time for the industry. So better times ahead.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ekpo, you gave us the a bit of a different perspective. How are you feeling and how optimistic are you feeling about things going forward?
The one thing I have seen in my few short years is that the Nigerian's entrepreneurial spirit is limitless in its ability to innovate, to open new vistas. So I am certain that we will crack what I call the logistic problem. Austin talked about it. All we have really is that problem of getting fuel to our various energy sources. We have them already. I keep saying, and I think we should really pay attention to this, we already have a 50,000 megawatt market in the country. 4,000 megawatts on the grid is less than 10% of it. And so the challenge is, how do you fuel the rest of that market to make it a little bit more cost efficient? What the government's role in this will be is to ask the question, how do we help you? And it's not always the case that the government actually knows what to do. Once in a while, perhaps for once, it should let the market lead and tell it what to do and what bottlenecks to remove, what challenges to help it overcome, what obstacles to remove. The indices are there, the enablers are there. And I think I vote really strongly for what Rolake has said. The money is also there domestically. Our pension funds are awash with cash. It's how to give them the assets to invest into that is the challenge. And that's what I call the logistic challenge. And I'm sure that we have enough ability to innovate our way around these obstacles.
Well, thank you very much. I too am quite optimistic. We have real problems, but we have the opportunities are there and the money is there. There's an opportunity to have this multiplier effect, like Mr. Avuru said, but for sure we have a long way to go. And I'm sure everybody on here agrees with that. So I think the hope that we all have, that I certainly have, is coming from these kind of conversations and other ongoing conversations, that the government and private sector can continue to work together to reignite the Nigeria's energy sector, which was more a hope for this conversation. So in closing, I'd like to say thank you to all the incredible panelists for giving of their time. The perspectives were rich and diverse, and together I think they form a whole of what we want to do. I also like to thank the audience for listening and for joining us. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.